Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre. The symposium is being broadcast on Friday, April 19th, and it is pre-recorded. So if there's some earth-shattering developments which occur on the 19th, that's why you may not hear about them. And as people may be aware, the reason for this is that I and Jose Vega are in the throes of the completely unconstitutional and outrageous petitioning to get our names on the ballot. I need 45,000 ballot signatures from New York registered voters. So if you'd like to come to the state or you're in the state and you'd like to volunteer to help with this, please sign up at sayreforsenate.com. That being said, we are in really an unbelievable situation, clearly at a point of transition for mankind. The old order, the colonial order, is dead and over, and the majority of the world's people are rejecting it. Unfortunately, we have in the US a cabal, the people who ran the witch hunt against Lyndon LaRouche, who assassinated Kennedy, covered up the crimes of 9/11, have been running the show, and therefore the United States is not representing a policy which is actually in the interest of the American people. We saw that today very clearly at the United Nations, where the United States is back up to its old dirty tricks, and in this case vetoed a resolution for Palestinian statehood. You cannot have a peace process, you cannot have negotiations in good faith unless there is recognition of a Palestinian state with equal rights and negotiating powers of an Israeli state. So this was cynical and ugly, and it sort of falls in place with the assertions of our John Kirby claiming that UN Security Council resolutions that there be a ceasefire are non-binding. We don't have to uphold the Convention on Genocide in 1948, the ruling of the International Court of Justice. So here is Biden running around the planet talking about a rules-based order, but we're flaunting all the rules. And we see that in the case of the ongoing legal witch hunt against former President Donald Trump. Whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, you have a right to vote. You should have a right to freedom of speech. We don't need to use the Department of Justice and the FBI to silence voices of those whom we disagree with. Similarly, with presidential contender Robert Kennedy Jr., who is being all but blacked out of the media, not granted Secret Service protection, etc. So the old empire is on such a tottery last legs that they can't even allow any candidate who might not conform to their wishes perfectly to be given a fair shake at the elections. And so you see in the case of Jose Vega and myself, two actually good candidates for whom you don't have to hold your nose when you vote, that they don't want us on the ballot at all. Now, let me further say that the war danger has been greatly increased in the wake of a few matters. One is the escalating mobilization against Russia, where we have Macron talking about sending ground troops, the Germans talking about using Taurus missiles to blow up the Kerch Bridge, and the terror attack on the Crocus Theater, which the Russians are investigating, and the roads lead to the Ukrainian intelligence. And of course, that is intertwined completely with US and British intelligence. This is very bad, and the Russian comments that they're no longer in a special military operation, but a state of war. And then more recently, the Israeli illegal violation of international law strike on Iran. What do I mean? They struck the Iranian embassy and consulate in Damascus, Syria, which is the same thing as a strike on Iran. That's Iranian territory legally, killing 12 people. And Iran responded in a very measured way, but a very thought out way. Scott Ritter, the weapons expert, made the point that the fact that 9 of Iran's missiles actually hit their targets in the Yoav Desert indicate that this great iron dome, all of the algorithms and technology of Israel and the United States are not as impermeable as we thought. And perhaps the US, backed by Israel, would not win such a war. So some are warning, would Israel use a nuclear weapon against Iran? There are Israelis who've already spoken of using nuclear weapons against Gaza. Would they do that? Iran and Russia are very closely allied. What are the implications of that? What does the US do now if it really can't win militarily? So it's a very unstable, very dangerous situation. And I wanted to invite my friend and colleague, Dave Christie, on because one whole nefarious aspect of this is the role of cybersecurity, AI, the interface of all kinds of computer programming, artificial intelligence, algorithms, autopilots, and people operating that to control our thoughts, our behavior, our freedom of speech, and now our military policy, even selecting strikes and designing policy, which puts us in a quite peculiar position. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Dave Christie. And Dave, thanks very much for joining us. And I'd like you to just share what you think is important about this and why.
All right. Thank you, Diane. And if you have anything that you want to add or anything that you want clarification or think should be elaborated, just jump in. Well, in particular, I think obviously the question of the control of information, which is how often this crowd sees it within the so-called cyber realm. It's different for us. We view it as the domain of ideas, which do transform humanity, do transform the world. Ideas have a literally physical weight in the universe in terms of the discoveries that are made, the application of that, the improvement of the application of that in the domain of science, technology, artistic creation. That is the only means by which humanity improves itself. But that is exactly the kind of discussion that this crowd would like to shut down precisely at this moment of profound transformation. So what I would like to cover is, there's a lot that has come out concerning the censorship industrial complex. There was the Twitter files release and the work of Matt Taibbi, Schellenberger, Gutentag, others that worked with them on the Twitter files. I would still reference this, reference in the last discussion, the dialogue that Mike Benz, some sort of had a cyber portfolio at the State Department under the Trump administration for a brief time, and otherwise runs a Freedom Online, something along those lines. You can look it up. But he did an interview with Tucker Carlson, which I think really lays the groundwork for how this Silicon Valley and agencies of the government have formed public-private partnerships for regime change. And obviously, we've seen how that's worked in the Arab Spring, the Maidan in Kiev. But what Benz asserts in that interview with Tucker Carlson is that CISA has effectively, that's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency headed by Jen Easterly now, that CISA was effectively deputized to do that which was usually only oriented towards foreign nations to now do that within the United States in terms of censorship and controlling the political dynamic. And obviously, we know of CISA's role during the, the ouster of, or the 2020 election of Trump, or well, what ended up being Biden. CISA's role in that. Trump did fire the head of CISA at that time, Chris Krebs. Anyway, but what I would like to look at is in all of the censorship industrial complex and the control over the political situation and relating to wars, as Diane mentioned, the AI and these different aspects, is the British role, because I think we have to remember that we are dealing with the fact that the British, the City of London, Wall Street are in a collapse mode. That part was always baked into the cake, so to speak. But what they don't have is they don't have the political control over the planet anymore. They don't have the ability to implement Malthusian genocide, collapse the global population, which has always been, what the British have, said is their aims. And so I'd like to go into the British role in terms of the cyber side, and also go into what plans are for the integration of critical infrastructure, which is kind of one of these buzzwords. And I'd like to elaborate what I think, at least what I think that means, particularly as it relates to finances. But as we know, elections have now been included into critical infrastructure. So where I'd like to start is just going into the role of Robert Hannigan. Now, Robert Hannigan was the head of GCHQ from, I think it was the tail end of 2015 up to the immediate days after Trump was sworn in as president. And this was around the time of a controversy where GCHQ, the government communications headquarter of the UK, which is the NSA equivalent, but essentially GCHQ was allowing intelligence to be passed through NSA, bypassing things like FISA and warrants and things that would be required in order to feed intelligence in and fuel what became Russiagate. Now, Hannigan had earlier played a critical role in this when he met with John Brennan, then the CIA director. This was summer of 2016, so right before the election. And the main topic of this was the so-called hack of the DNC, right, where the Russian GRU hacked into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, released information, emails that Podesta and Hillary Clinton had written, and about their plans to basically kick Bernie Sanders out and have the coronation ceremony for Hillary Clinton, right? So that was the so-called hack of the DNC that was attributed to Russia. Now, it was later found out they had no evidence of that, and there were two firms, CrowdStrike and FireEye, which became Mandiant and is now owned by Google Cloud. I'll reference CrowdStrike and just call it Mandiant for now, because that is relevant to this question of the integration of critical infrastructure. But I think before all that began, you have to look at what Hannigan set into motion. So when he came in, again, this was the end of, actually, maybe it was 2014. Forgive my being off on it, but it was right in the immediate aftermath of. What's
You're
that?
lucky I'm not an FBI agent.
Right.
But go ahead.
Actually, it was 2014, because it was the year after Snowden had, released all the documents, which showed that, effectively Silicon Valley had become shills for GCHQ and NSA. Now that the telecommunications companies and Silicon Valley firms had already sort of been roped into the activities of NSA, and other intelligence agencies in the post 9/11 era under the threat of, terrorism and so forth. We had to monitor things. We had the Patriot Act and so on and so forth. People probably know some of the history on this. But what happened is in the aftermath of the Snowden release, Silicon Valley was in panic mode because it wasn't a good public relations for them. And so what Hannigan did then is sort of to whip them back in line. He said, "Oh, well, you've become the command and control post of ISIS." Now, of course, ISIS is,
who was the command
that
and
Silicon Valley had become the command and control networks. Actually, let me read. I let.
You're going to explain how he made that argument?
Yes. Okay. So the basic idea was ISIS was recruiting on social media and so forth. They were also disseminating their videos. There were stories around this time where British teenage girls were running away to Syria or wherever it was and becoming brides of the ISIS cult, death cult. There was all these sort of horror stories, and it was promoted the idea that, oh, Silicon Valley, because they're not working closely with NSA and GCHQ as they should be. We should be censoring these videos and so on, and therefore you've become the command and control networks of ISIS. That was the argumentation. But you have to consider that just the year before, they had been shown to be exactly what Hannigan wanted them to be, which was they were the Silicon Valley was basically the arm of GCHQ and NSA, right? So now what happened is he made a very quick shift, accusing them of being ISIS, to then that they were agents of Putin or Russian agents as well. So I want to read something from David Sanger, who is one of these, journalists of the New York Times. This is from Hannigan's New York Times article. "The Brits told us the Russians were hacking our election." And the subtitle was, "To the British eavesdroppers who uncovered Russia's hack of the Democratic headquarters, it looked like Watergate all over again, but no one in the US seemed to care." So this is what Sanger's article said. "Hannigan's job was to bring GCHQ into the 21st century, the century of cyber conflict. Past heads of GCHQ barely communicated with the public, but on his first day on the job, Hannigan took a direct shot at Silicon Valley firms in a column in the Financial Times." This is from Hannigan in the Financial Times, quote, "However much they may dislike it, they have become the command and control networks of choice for terrorists and criminals and must learn how to cooperate with the intelligence agencies of the Western democracies. Yet," and this is Sanger saying this, "yet once he settled into the job, he found a player who worried him more than Facebook and Google, Vladimir Putin." Okay, so I reference that because look at what was happening at the National Security Agency and US Cyber Command, which, just so people know, whoever is the head of NSA is also the head of Cyber Command and is also the head of the Central Security Services, which is the signals intelligence for all the different, military intelligence, basically. Anyway, so what was happening at that time is that right after Hannigan was, taking Silicon Valley to task for being ISIS sympathizers, US Cyber Command launched what was called Joint Task Force Ares. And this was to, take on ISIS online. Now, remember,
really, I have to say, because we created and fund ISIS, right?
and and that was the point that Michael Flynn had effectively made. He said, "Look, it was Obama's policies which created ISIS, and that there was warnings. Michael Flynn was the head of, three-star general, I believe, at the time. He was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, if I have that right. Anyway, he
Yes.
basically was warning that this was coming and that we weren't doing anything about it, and it was allowed to happen. Now, think back to what CIA and the British intelligence had been doing, using Osama bin Laden and terrorist networks for a long time. The Chechen operation, they were always using this as a form of, irregular warfare or proxy warfare against the Soviet Union back in the days of Osama bin Laden when they were in Afghanistan. But of course, the same thing with Chechnya and so on. So it's always been British intelligence that has run, so-called Islamic terrorism. So yeah,
I
so
think so we're basically accusing them to scare them of being ISIS sympathizers when in reality we created ISIS. And
yeah,
I
and
interviewed Vanessa Beeley last week, and she was very clear that ISIS, the US and ISIS, because the US directs ISIS to their dirty operations in Syria, coordinated with the Israelis to create diversions so that Israel would have a clear shot on the Iranian consulate in Damascus.
mm, mm,
So
yeah.
anyway, go ahead.
Well, and what was Silicon Valley doing? What were these social media companies doing? They were participating in the Arab Spring. You had all the operations in Egypt, and then of course a lot of this was directed at Syria. And so this is the backdrop for so-called Joint Task Force Ares, right, run by U.S. Cyber Command and NSA and so on. And Nakasone, who just left as the head of NSA, he was the commander of this at the time. But what happened is in early 2016, there was a big confab in Silicon Valley, and the idea of ISIS being behind everything, and therefore we got to get Silicon Valley on board to fight ISIS. That happened in early 2016, but then by the middle of 2016, it was already shifting into Russia, right? Because of the DNC hack, which Newland had actually said she knew about it. She had gotten information back in 2015. So in other words, all this, the transformation that Hannigan was leading, shifting GCHQ and their offensive cyber operations from ISIS over to Putin, this was already beginning to happen in 2016. And what was called Joint Task Force Ares of US Cyber Command then became the Russia Small Group. And that was, and then eventually the Russia Small Group became the Election Security Group in 2018. So that's relevant, just in terms of the control of the political dynamic. Also going back to this thing that Mike Benz told Tucker Carlson, which is that CISA effectively was doing what we were doing with regime change internationally, that was now deployed against the United States. And under the Election Security Group, which was NSA and US Cyber Command, they collaborated very closely with FBI and CISA on matters of disinformation and defense of elections, penetration into and foreign penetration into the elections and so on. All right, so that's just a little bit of a backdrop, but I want to get into the other thing that Hannigan was doing, or was at least involved in, and created an agency called the National Cybersecurity Center, which was out of GCHQ. It was even, its opening day was blessed by a visit by the Queen of England, who was alive at that time. So this is 2016. And what Hannigan said is that it was Mark Carney, who was the head of the Bank of England, who had come to him and said, look, we have all this confusion in industry and we need a streamlined flow of information And so Hannigan said, okay, well, so we'll create this national cyber security center. And now, what had just happened before the creation of this agency that Hannigan created? Brexit, right? So that was part of the confusion, was how are we going to ensure that the information flows and so on are all coordinated given what has just occurred with Brexit. But really, if you consider it, Brexit and the Trump election were signaling that the citizens of the transatlantic, the United States and the UK at least, were not going along with the game. They were voting for Brexit. They were voting for Trump, an political outsider that was not part of the game. So this National Cybersecurity Center collaborated very closely with CISA on all kinds of matters of disinformation, COVID, and Ukraine, and other things. But what was the other thing that they were doing is they were collaborating with, or they effectively created. I won't go. There's a sort of a string of acronyms that are difficult to just keep in track, but basically it was a city of London, the top 20 banks of London created a financial cyber unit, let's just call it, that worked with this agency that Hannigan just created. Now, this agency in the UK also collaborated with what was called the Financial Services Financial Systemic Analysis Resilience Center. Okay, now this agency, we'll just call it FSARC, worked with US Cyber Command and all of the top Wall Street banks. It was basically comprised, this FSARC was comprised of the top
No,
Wall Street
why do
banks.
these banks, why do these banks need this?
Because there were other hacks there were other hacks that were going on attributed to Russia, discovered by CrowdStrike and FireEye, like the DNC hack.
Right.
There was the NotPetya attack. There was all these attacks that were being attributed by Russia. There was the North Koreans supposedly went after Sony. Later, there was the Colonial Pipeline. There was Solar Winds. There was all these cyber attacks that were being attributed to Russia and North Korea and Iran and all these different. And so what the Wall Street banks were saying, or this FSARC was saying, is we have to get everybody on board with cybersecurity. But what they were doing is they were sharing, Wall Street banks were sharing people's, accounts and information and with US Cyber Command. And so
This is one of the things that people are so worried about, who are afraid of this central bank digital currency, I guess, comes into this, right?
there's certainly that. And but it's really, so there's another thing that's going on, because when Missouri versus Biden case, the MDM team, that's the malinformation team of CISA, this guy named Brian Scully, was being deposed in the Missouri versus Biden thing, and he was asked something about hammer and scorecard, which is a thing about elections. And he sort of flippantly mentions about the idea of that CISA was monitoring social media for critical infrastructure, including on the matter of bank runs. And you kind of see you can sort of see it in the transcript. The Missouri, I think it was the Attorney General, I forget who it was, but basically said, "What do you mean bank runs? I haven't heard anything about bank runs. Why is CISA working with Treasury on bank runs?" Well, so you have to wonder, this control of the information space in the financial sector also related to the fact that they know the system's gone, and they're trying to reach out and control all different types of information flows, not just simply what people are saying on social media, but also what are people saying on Wall Street? What are people saying in the city of London about the direction of the economy and the financial system and so on?
Well,
Now,
what's the interface of this really interference and gross invasion of privacy and attempt to manipulate what people think, the relationship of this to the way wars are being fought or what's happening with the military?
well, let me just make one brief point here
Okay.
because this will get into what's a kind of a similar project that's on in Ukraine, okay? As a kind of a laboratory. I think that Ukraine is sort of a laboratory for an integration of, ultimately what Helga has referred to as the military industrial financial complex. I know Ray McGovern has the kind of, even expanded, but the financial
You
part
said,
of
I
that.
think you froze for a minute. You were saying the word Ukraine, is
Oh,
that right?
yes, I was
Okay.
saying that this organization that I mentioned that was coordinating the banks and so on, you'll see how this relates to Ukraine and sort of the broader perspective of a kind of a top down control of the military industrial financial complex. Okay, so this project that I mentioned of this FSARC grouping of the top Wall Street banks working with US Cyber Command was there was a project called Project Indigo, which was run to coordinate this. Now, Indigo is the current head of U.S. Cyber Command and NSA, Timothy Hawk, says transformed into what's called the Pathfinder Initiative. So beyond finance, it would now start working with communication sectors as well as energy sectors, all under a similar cyber umbrella. Now, the
Right.
guy that oversaw this project or this FSARC project, he set up the cybersecurity program for Ukraine. And so if you actually look at what's going on in Ukraine, you have a vast public-private partnership of all these different, um, entities on Wall Street, entities on Silicon Valley. Effectively, I mean, just look at what's going on in Ukraine. BlackRock's running the show there. The big Archer Daniels Midland, they're all coming in. The cartel apparatus is coming in to run the economy, while meanwhile, all of the information flows and the military operations in Ukraine vectored against Russia are all being run by NATO and CIA and the intelligence communities and so on. So, in other words, this kind of through cyber is, really they're using Ukraine as a laboratory, but there's similar operations being run in the United States. Now, just to maybe,
I want to just, this
yeah,
is a
go
thought
ahead.
I had earlier, which I want to bring up, which is really important because in the course of the campaign at various conferences, I meet people who work in cybersecurity, who even work in cybersecurity for the military, and they say, well, we see how Russia, Iran, these countries are hacking us. They're hacking this, they're hacking that. And I really want to remind everyone that Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe, whistleblowers from the NSA, told us in the LaRouche organization, I mean, about a program called the Marble Framework, because our intelligence agencies can create fake IP addresses to make it look as if a hack is coming from Russia or a hack is coming from China. And I think Bill said there were several countries which they could do this: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. So I think it's very damaging because you get people who work in these industries. No, I can't tell you the evidence, but I know the Iranians are hacking us. when it absolutely could be being done from within the United States and the bowels of our various intelligence and so-called security agencies. That's all.
Well, and if I'm not mistaken, the Marble framework was part of the Vault 7 release of that, that was posted on WikiLeaks. And it has been said that that was the, straw that broke the camel's back for Julian Assange, and that, his present stay in Belmarsh was basically, in addition to Pompeo's threats of assassination and so forth, was related to that because, and I mentioned these two firms, CrowdStrike and FireEye, or Mandiant. They were the ones that discovered the DNC hack, yet the president of CrowdStrike later admitted in congressional testimony in 2017 that they didn't have the evidence, right? But those firms were the ones that also discovered SolarWinds, Colonial Pipelines, JBS Foods, which are like the rally cry that everybody has to open up the gates for cybersecurity. We need to come in. We need to have this integrated approach in all these different sectors of the economy, our critical infrastructure of the lifeline sectors is how the Timothy Hawk referred to them, of finance, communications, and energy. But now, of course, it's elections infrastructure. It's on and on and on. So now Mandiant, the vice president of that, Sandra Joyce, she was just at a recent cyber conference in Kiev, called the Kiev International Cybersecurity Forum 2024: Resilience in Cyber Warfare. And she was there. Jen Easterly was there, one of the top cyber guys at State Department. Nathaniel Fick was there. This guy I mentioned, Greg Rattray, that he and his partner Matthew Murray, who set up the cyber security strategy for Ukraine, they were there. This grouping called Molfar was there. Molfar has one of these latest hit lists that has a bunch of political figures, and of course Helga Zepp-LaRouche is, always makes these various hit lists. So anyway, but the point that you're just saying, Diane, is that this, cybersecurity, we can't tell you what it is, and then you look at these private firms that are, and the other point on this is if GCHQ and NSA, they would have known the hack of the DNC. They control the cables where, so they could have provided the evidence, yet they use these private agencies to be the ones that come out and say, So anyway, that's I think at least the relevance of where this goes. But I think maybe just to take a step back, if you think of what is cyber, where does the word even come from? Well, it comes in modern form. It comes from the cybernetics grouping, which was sort of began in the 1950s. This was around Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann. There was a whole network of these people. In fact, Mr. LaRouche, basically launched his political career in refuting these people. But the term cybernetics comes from the Greek of Kubernetes, which means the helmsman, meaning that you're steering a ship and you have to kind of coordinate the various parts of the ship to make sure everybody's got the, rowing in the same direction and moving the ship along at the same time. And that time we have really had the push by this crowd under British direction to integrate society, and all the information flows through the various aspects of our critical infrastructure, all the different sectors of the economy. This is sort of their wet dream to bring this all together under their control, particularly at a moment of economic collapse, the fact that the system has gone, and to ensure that everybody is in line for the geopolitical interests of London and Wall Street, which is obviously using the social media and so on, and to vector everybody into supporting the various wars and so on. So that's kind of the general gist of what I wanted to at least get across. I don't. There's probably some details or maybe some questions that you might have, Diane. I will just say this briefly. By the time this airs tomorrow, it is said that we're going to have a vote in the Senate on this renewal of the FISA, which has the kind of the update to the Section 702, which is being described as the what do they call it? The everybody's a spy or anybody's a spy, which will kind of reword things so that they can now throw out the net even further. And of course, there were amendments that were attempting to narrow the scope of this so that you actually had to get warrants. But of course, that was there was a tie vote, and Mike Johnson came out and broke the tie. But just so Edward Snowden said concerning this, he said the NSA is just days away from taking over the internet, and it's not on the front page of any newspaper because no one has noticed. So hopefully the Senate, Ron Wyden has said he views this as chilling and that he's going to do everything within his power. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Yeah, that's just to note that.
Okay, well, just as you were saying that, the news has come across of three major explosions in Iran.
Mhm.
Israel is beginning their so-called counter-strike in response to Iran's counter-strike for Israel's illegal attack on the Iranian embassy. So this thing is definitely escalating, and I think and they're saying prices of oil are spiking. Who knows where this will be by, I say tonight, when you are watching this, the viewers are watching this situation. It just underscores how urgent it is what Helga Zepp-LaRouche put forward, the Oasis plan, and the idea we have to get peace. And I think there's a reason for this cyber control. We see it in the United States. When you were talking about Silicon Valley being accused of supporting ISIS, look at how the news media refers to people protesting genocide in Gaza, the New York Post being one of the worst, the anti-Israel protesters. Well, they're against Israel committing genocide, but it's a complete fabrication. Or they say Iran's attack, they might as well call it Iran's unprovoked attack on Israel, except Israel bombed Iran and killed top senior Iranian generals. And Americans should consider how we would respond if something like that happened. And I think what you really see is why Martin Luther King and others were recruited to the idea of nonviolence. That if we continue on this pathway, there really is going to be nothing left, period. There will be nothing left. So we have to get a major motion to change the direction of policy in the United States. The action vetoing Palestinian statehood is just indicative of how evil the policymakers are right now in our nation. And you have a few congressmen who fight on this issue, who fight on that issue, who've shown some courage. But in terms of them coming together and actually demanding this has to stop, or none of us is going to be here anymore, we don't see.
Yeah, I would just say, and I think you have a sense of this. I mean, the attempt to control all aspects of the dialogue and information and really ideas is obviously what all dictatorships do. but it's also the fact that they have to do that desperation, and I think these moves by Hannigan and so forth in light of Brexit and again, whatever people think of Trump, it was certainly a political shock to the system, and is an indication that the American people and the people of the transatlantic world more generally are not going along with the rules-based order of London and Wall Street. And so and I know we've run into this all the time where people say, yeah, but I'm the only one that thinks this, and that's because they're in this media and social media space and so on that makes them think that they're alone. But in reality, they're not, because otherwise, why would they be going through these draconian measures to, prevent the flow of ideas? Because, anyway, so they are desperate. I think we have to realize that on multiple fronts, not least of which is the fact that a new system is being put together, led by the BRICS, and that door is constantly being left open by those nations. And I think if we, as what Helga has been saying, is we've got to get the people of the transatlantic to recognize that the global are working with the global South is the way to destroy London and Wall Street once and for all, this imperial power.
Yes. Well, we'll see how this looks by the time this is broadcast. Thank you very much for joining me, and I would urge everybody watching to call the Congress on no more weapons for Israel or Ukraine, and to stop these illegal dictatorial actions. People have to be heard. Right now, we have to be in the streets, and we have to have in mind what the future actually should look like, what the new paradigm should be, how human beings should be living, which is not what we're seeing coming from the policymakers in the United States today. And again, anyone who wants to help with the petitioning, please sign up at sareforsenate.com. Thank you.